Canada is one of the most popular and most respected countries in the world. Home to an estimated 39 million people, the country is generally seen as America's well-behaved cousin, mostly because of its proximity to the United States and the fact that Canadians are generally well-natured people. Thanks to both a mix of its proximity to the United States and its own muscle, Canada has become one of the most prosperous countries in the world. The country's GDP stands at about $2.5 trillion, making it the 9th richest nation on Earth. And Canada also shares the world's longest land border with the United States, measuring at an impressive 8,890 kilometers. Today, there's no denying the fact that Canada is a major player in global economics. However, despite this, it is also no secret that the world economy has been through a bit of a rough patch. And several of the biggest economies have been hit especially hard. Well, Canada is one such country. Real cracks in Canada's economy are starting to show, and experts are even betting on the country to see a recession in the near future. So what on earth is going on in the Great White North? And is there a possibility of Canada starving off an economic crisis? Let's dive into it. To really understand the origins of Canada's economic woes, we need to go a few years into the past. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the whole world economy was put on notice. Millions died, companies were forced to shut down, and it seemed like the entire world was getting ready for a hard reset. Interestingly, Canadians experienced a bit of a reshuffling when it came to their economy. One of the major issues that plagued the country was the fact that the cost of living became almost unbearable. Everything, especially food, has become pretty expensive. Per a report from the Food and Agriculture Association, a branch of the United Nations that deals with issues like food security and quality, global food prices hit a new high in February of 2022. In fact, food prices increased by an average of about 24% between 2021 and 2022. As you can imagine, this only made life difficult for everyday folk. Another major issue that has affected Canadians is inflation. So to understand this, you once again need to head back to the pandemic. When the health crisis hit, governments around the world swung into action, printing trillions and trillions of dollars and distributing it in the form of palliatives and stimulus funds to citizens. The US government spent a total of $2.3 trillion, giving $1,200 to each person, plus an additional $500 per child. While over in Canada, the government spent a total of about $360 billion on COVID relief. Considering that this is well over 10% of the country's GDP, this amount meant that there was a lot of money in circulation. And for good reason. Here's the thing though, with everyone now having so much money, spending became easier. And this overall splurging on COVID relief ended up biting the global economy when it led to widespread inflation within the past year. The prices of just about everything else became much higher, and as the COVID checks started to dry up, people started to have real issues affording the basic necessities. Over in Canada, inflation has become a killer. This year, the country saw annual inflation crossing the 5% mark for the first time in about 30 years. And to make things worse, total wages in the country only rose by an average of 2.4%. With inflation rising more than twice the rate of wages, you can imagine just how difficult life must have been for Canadians over the past year and change. As if the rising prices of food wasn't enough of an issue, Canadians have also had to deal with surging gas prices. Between 2021 and 2022, average gas prices in Canada rose by over 50%. And to make things worse, this issue isn't necessarily due to the pandemic and its effects. If you recall, the world is currently dealing with several conflicts at the same time. One of the bloodiest and most lethal is the war in Ukraine, which started off in February 2022. Just as the world was starting to stabilize a bit following the pandemic, Vladimir Putin of Russia decided that it was a perfect time to invade nearby Ukraine. And in a few days, his army was already in the neighboring country, wreaking havoc. Not prepared to take things lying down, the Ukrainians struck back, and both parties have been locked in a deadly conflict ever since. When the Ukraine war really began, the world realized that this was an act of aggression from the Russians, and as you'd imagine, there were consequences for that. As a consequence, the international community decided to hit Russia with several sanctions. Several notable Russian billionaires and oligarchs had their properties seized by authorities in foreign countries, and pretty much anyone who had links to the Kremlin was blacklisted across the world. The sanctions were especially brutal on crude oil, which is Russia's biggest export. And considering the fact that Russia is one of the world's largest producers and exporters of crude oil, the country's exclusion from much of global economic activity has meant that crude oil supply would be slimmer. With crude oil getting scarcer, fuel prices skyrocketed. Considering that Canada is one of the most economically advanced countries and also one of the top 10 largest marketplaces for vehicles in the world, you can understand how this hike in prices would ultimately affect Canadians who now have to pay more money to afford their everyday commute. And although the rise in prices has been able to stabilize a bit in the past few months, many Canadians still feel very financially stressed. Prices are rising, and it doesn't look like this trend is about to stop anytime soon. Now, of all the issues facing the Canadian economy, the housing market appears to be the most significant. We already spoke about how food prices are rising, and so are gas prices. But the Canadian housing market is really where the pain points start to get insane. At present, finding affordable housing in Canada is almost a myth, especially in some of its biggest cities. And the issue isn't even one that began with the pandemic. You see, ever since the 2008 financial crisis, house prices in Canada have doubled on average. It's understandable, of course. Back in 2009, Canada's government rolled out a stimulus package to help citizens who had suffered heavy losses as a result of the financial meltdown. This, as well as the fact that interest rates were pretty low, led to a significant spending spree across the country. Canadians were encouraged to pile up debt to buy homes, and the stimulus from the pandemic only made this whole thing worse. Another interesting thing when you consider the housing crisis is the fact that it appears to have been fueled by movement. When it comes to total land area, Canada is the second largest country in the world. Its 9.9 million kilometers square stands second only to Russia, making it an incredibly vast nation indeed. Despite this, however, about 90% of Canada's population actually lives within 100 miles of its border with the United States. The proximity to the United States, as well as the fact that this region is said to have the most arable land in all of Canada, has led to many people migrating here and settling. As such, you can imagine that the cost of housing in this region would skyrocket. Just as well, we need to consider the role and impact of immigration on Canada's housing market. Today, Canada is one of the most attractive destinations for immigrants. Official data shows that Canada receives about 500,000 immigrants annually, giving it one of the highest immigrant rates per population in the world. With about 8 million immigrants with permanent residency living in the country as of 2022, Canada has proven to be a haven for people looking to leave their country in search of a better life. The issue, however, is that this influx of immigrants is only fueling a massive housing crisis. Now, whenever people enter Canada for the first time, they usually initially rent homes instead of buying them. This helps to sustain demand for rental units, and if you check the prices of home rentals in most developed countries, you'd find that they have been rising relative to home purchases. However, what really makes the Canadian economy different is the fact that its citizens' ability to rent is starting to hit a limit. It would have been fine in a period when interest rates were low, but with the government now resorting to high interest rates in order to control inflation, homeownership is simply becoming unattainable for most Canadians. And considering the fact that rental prices are already high, there really is almost nowhere to run for many people looking to get their own place. To help make up for this gap, many young Canadians are now cutting back on spending on several things, including and especially having children. More people are looking to have fewer kids, and this means that there is a tendency that Canada's population will skew older in the coming years. If this happens, then the country will once again rely on immigrants and migrant workers to contribute to its labor force. And as more people come in, the country's housing market will only get more crowded. At the moment, the biggest thing that Canada has going for it appears to be its close ties with the United States. Canada is the biggest purchaser of US goods, making the country America's most important trade partner. And because the countries are neighbors, much of the prosperity that enters the United States eventually spills to Canada. American investors invest in Canadian firms. American companies expand to Canada, and so much more. However, would all of that really be able to save the country when its own economic fundamentals aren't so strong? To be fair, Canada's status as one of the most prosperous countries in the world isn't necessarily under threat. In fact, these economic hardships aren't really peculiar to the country alone. But it's pretty safe to say that something needs to be done here. Otherwise, Canada could be in for a really rough ride. What are your thoughts though? Is the Great White North really in for a recession? Let us know in the comments.